Here is something I have not seen anyone talk about clearly yet. Everyone is covering the blockade. Everyone is covering Iran. But there is a country sitting thousands of miles away from Hormuz that is making more money from this war than anyone who is actually in it. And I think you deserve to know who that is and exactly how much. In February 2026, before the war started, global trade moved through three major corridors. The southern route through the Strait of Hormuz and the Red Sea carried approximately 30% of all container traffic between Asia and Europe. The northern route through Russia, which had already been partially disrupted by the war in Ukraine and Western sanctions, carried roughly 15% of Eurasian land trade. And the middle route, the one that runs through the Caucasus, the Caspian Sea, and Turkey, carried less than 8% of regional freight. That was February. By April, 2 months into the Iran war, the southern route is functionally closed. Hormuz is blockaded. The Red Sea has been a war zone since Houthi attacks escalated in late 2023. Insurance costs for ships trying to transit either waterway have increased by 300% to 500% in some cases. Shipping companies are not taking the risk. The northern route through Russia is still under sanctions. European companies cannot use it without triggering secondary penalties. Asian companies are cautious about being seen as sanctions violators. That route has not expanded to fill the gap. What is left is the middle route, and the middle route runs directly through Turkey. Let me be very specific about what that means in numbers, because I think the scale of this shift has not been properly reported. The Middle Corridor, as it is officially called, is a multimodal freight network that connects China to Europe via Kazakhstan, the Caspian Sea, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey. Before the war, this corridor handled approximately 2.3 million tons of freight per year. By March 2026, according to logistics data from Maersk and analysts at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, freight volumes on the Middle Corridor had increased by 340%. That is not a typo. 340% growth in 2 months. Container traffic that used to go south through Hormuz or Suez is now being rerouted north through the Caspian and west through Turkey. And every ton of freight that moves through that corridor generates revenue for the countries that control the infrastructure. Turkey controls the final and most critical leg of that journey. Turkey is the gateway between Asia and Europe on this route. Every rail line, every port, every customs checkpoint that goods pass through on their way to European markets is either on Turkish soil or depends on Turkish logistics infrastructure to function, and Turkey is charging for that access. Here is where the $45 billion figure comes from, and I want to break it down precisely because I think specificity matters more than hyperbole. The first stream of revenue is transit fees. Every container that moves through Turkish ports, every freight train that crosses Turkish rail lines, every truck that uses Turkish highways pays a fee. The Turkish government has increased those fees by an average of 18% since the war began, citing increased demand and infrastructure costs. According to Turkey's Ministry of Transport, transit fee revenues in the first quarter of 2026 were $4.2 billion compared to $1.1 billion in the same quarter of 2025. That is a nearly four-fold increase in 3 months. If that pace holds, and logistics analysts believe it will given the continued closure of Hormuz and the Red Sea, Turkey's annual transit revenue will exceed $16 billion by year-end, up from $4.3 billion in 2025. The second stream is infrastructure contracts. Turkey is not just benefiting from existing infrastructure. Turkey is building new infrastructure to handle the increased capacity, and other countries are paying for it. Kazakhstan, which sits at the eastern end of the Middle Corridor, has signed contracts worth $8.7 billion with Turkish construction firms to build new rail terminals, expand the port of Aktau on the Caspian Sea, and upgrade road connections between Kazakh cities and the border crossings into the Caucasus. Those contracts were signed in March 2026, 1 month into the war, because Kazakhstan looked at the closure of Hormuz and the Red Sea and realized that its only viable export route to Europe now runs through Turkey. Kazakhstan needs Turkish logistics expertise, and Turkey is providing it at a premium. The third stream, and this is where the numbers get larger, is reconstruction contracts in Syria. Syria's civil war, which formally ended with a Turkish brokered agreement in late 2025, left the country's infrastructure in ruins. The reconstruction effort, funded by a combination of Gulf state investments, international development banks, and bilateral loans, is estimated to require $400 billion over the next decade. Turkey, as Syria's northern neighbor and the country that hosts the largest number of Syrian refugees, has positioned itself as the lead contractor for that reconstruction. In February 2026, Turkey's government announced that Turkish firms had secured contracts worth $11.3 billion for the first phase of Syria's reconstruction, covering roads, bridges, power plants, and water infrastructure. That figure does not include the secondary economic activity generated by Turkish companies operating in Syria, employing Syrian workers, sourcing materials from Turkish suppliers, and establishing long-term commercial relationships that will persist for years. The fourth stream is energy transit. Turkey has always been a critical energy corridor, with pipelines carrying Russian gas and Azerbaijani oil to European markets. But the war has increased the value of that position. European countries, desperate to reduce dependence on Russian energy after the Ukraine war and now facing supply disruptions from the Gulf, are looking to Azerbaijan and Central Asia as alternative sources. The expanded southern gas corridor, which runs through Turkey, is now carrying 30% more gas than it was in 2025. Turkey collects transit fees on every cubic meter of gas that passes through its territory. The Turkish Energy Ministry reported that energy transit revenues in Q1 2026 were $2.1 billion, up from $1.4 billion in Q1 2025. Extrapolated over the full year, that is an additional $2.8 billion in revenue directly attributable to the war's disruption of alternative energy routes. The fifth stream, and this one is harder to quantify but equally important, is geopolitical leverage converted into economic concessions. Turkey has been mediating between the United States and Iran throughout this war. Turkey hosted preliminary talks in Ankara. Turkey facilitated communication channels when direct U.S.-Iran dialogue was not possible. Turkey brokered ceasefires, offered guarantees, and positioned itself as the indispensable middle power. That diplomatic role has tangible economic value. The European Union, which has been trying to secure Turkey's cooperation on refugee management, trade facilitation, and regional stability for years, has offered Turkey a new customs union agreement that includes $6.4 billion in development funds and tariff reductions on Turkish exports. That agreement was signed in March 2026, 1 month into the war, and European officials privately acknowledged that the timing was not coincidental. Turkey's role as a mediator and as the controller of the Middle Corridor made Europe more willing to offer economic concessions it had previously withheld. Add those 5 streams together. Transit fees projected at $16 billion annually. Kazakhstan infrastructure contracts at $8.7 billion. Syrian reconstruction at $11.3 billion. Energy transit increases worth $2.8 billion. EU economic concessions valued at $6.4 billion. The total is $45.2 billion over the next 12 to 18 months. And that figure is conservative because it does not include secondary effects like increased tourism, expanded trade relationships, or the long-term value of being the dominant logistics hub for Eurasian trade. Turkey made $45 billion from this war without fighting a single battle. Now let me explain how Turkey positioned itself to capture that value, because I think the mechanics are as important as the outcome. Turkey did not stumble into this position by accident. Turkey has been building the infrastructure, the diplomatic relationships, and the strategic positioning for this moment for more than a decade. In 2015, Turkey launched the Middle Corridor Initiative as part of China's Belt and Road Framework. The goal was to create an alternative trade route that would reduce dependence on the southern maritime routes through Suez and Hormuz. At the time, most analysts saw it as a secondary priority, a hedge against unlikely disruptions. Turkey kept building anyway. Turkey upgraded the port of Mersin on the Mediterranean. Turkey expanded rail connections to the Georgian border. Turkey invested in logistics hubs in Kars and Erzurum. By 2025, before the war, the Middle Corridor was operational but underutilized. Then the war happened, and overnight, that underutilized infrastructure became the most valuable trade route in Eurasia. Turkey also built diplomatic capital by maintaining relationships with all sides simultaneously. Turkey is a NATO member, which gives it credibility with the United States and Europe. Turkey also maintained trade and diplomatic ties with Russia, even after the Ukraine war. Turkey built energy partnerships with Azerbaijan and Central Asian states. Turkey positioned itself as a mediator in the Syrian civil war, gaining leverage over reconstruction. And Turkey maintained a careful balance with Iran, never fully aligning but never fully opposing either. That multi-directional diplomacy, which critics often call opportunism, is precisely what allowed Turkey to step into the mediator role when the US-Iran war started. And that mediator role is what gave Turkey the leverage to secure the economic concessions I just described. There is a deeper strategic logic at work here, and I want to make it explicit because I think it explains not just Turkey's position, but the broader pattern of how this war is reshaping global power. Wars create winners and losers not just on the battlefield, but in the economic geography that emerges afterward. The countries that win are not always the ones that fight the hardest. Sometimes, the countries that win are the ones that control the alternatives when the primary routes break down. The United States went to war with Iran to secure the Strait of Hormuz and prevent Iranian nuclear weapons. America has spent billions on that war. America has lost service members. America has damaged its diplomatic relationships with allies who refused to join the blockade. And the net result, in economic terms, is that global trade is now flowing through a route that bypasses American influence almost entirely. The Middle Corridor is not controlled by America. It is not even particularly friendly to American strategic interests. It connects China to Europe via countries that are either neutral or in some cases quietly aligned against US preferences. Turkey is in NATO, but Turkey's economic interests in this corridor are not aligned with American efforts to isolate China or pressure Russia. The more trade flows through the Middle Corridor, the more economic leverage Turkey, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and Georgia gain, and the less leverage America has over the trade relationships that matter. This is what I mean when I say that the economic geography has shifted. The war was fought over Hormuz, but the strategic consequence is that Hormuz matters less now than it did 2 months ago. Not because the US blockade failed, though China's ability to move ships through it has certainly undermined its effectiveness, but because the world has found an alternative. And that alternative runs through a country that did not fire a single shot. Let me give you one more data point that I think makes this concrete. Maersk, one of the world's largest shipping companies, announced in March that it is opening a new regional hub in Istanbul to manage Middle Corridor logistics. Maersk's CEO said, and I want to give you the exact words, the Middle Corridor is no longer an alternative route. It is becoming the primary route for a significant portion of Eurasian trade. Maersk is betting billions of dollars that the shift I am describing is not temporary. Maersk believes that even after the war ends, even after Hormuz and the Red Sea reopen, a substantial portion of freight will continue to flow through the Middle Corridor because the infrastructure is now in place, the relationships are established, and the reliability has been proven. If Maersk is right, and I think they are, Turkey's $45 billion windfall is not a one-time event. It is the beginning of a structural shift in how goods move between Asia and Europe. And that shift will generate revenue for Turkey for decades. Now, I want to address the counter-argument because I think intellectual honesty requires it. The argument against my thesis is that Turkey's gains are temporary and fragile. Once the war ends and Hormuz reopens, shipping companies will revert to the southern route because it is faster and cheaper. The Middle Corridor, according to this argument, is a wartime anomaly, not a permanent shift. There is some truth to that. The southern maritime route is indeed faster. A container ship sailing from Shanghai to Rotterdam via Suez takes about 30 days. The same journey via the Middle Corridor, which requires offloading containers in Central Asia, transporting them by rail through the Caucasus and Turkey, and reloading them for the final leg to Europe, takes about 18 to 22 days under optimal conditions. The time savings are real, and once the security premium for southern routes decreases, some shippers will return. But here is why I think the shift is more durable than that argument suggests. First, the war has demonstrated that the southern route is not reliable. Hormuz has been closed or contested multiple times in the past 2 years. The Red Sea has been a war zone since late 2023. Shipping companies do not just optimize for speed and cost. They also optimize for risk. And the Middle Corridor, even if slower, has proven to be more predictable. Predictability has value, especially for high-value, time-sensitive freight, like electronics, pharmaceuticals, and automotive parts. Second, The infrastructure investments being made right now are sunk costs that will lower the operating cost of the middle corridor going forward. Kazakhstan is building new ports, Turkey is expanding rail capacity, Azerbaijan and Georgia are upgrading customs systems. Once those investments are complete, the cost differential between the middle corridor and the southern route will narrow significantly. And as the cost differential narrows, the reliability advantage becomes decisive. Third, geopolitical diversification is now a strategic priority for both China and Europe. China does not want to be entirely dependent on maritime routes that pass through choke points the U.S. Navy can blockade. Europe does not want to be entirely dependent on routes that pass through conflict zones in the Middle East. Both sides have strong incentives to maintain the middle corridor as a viable alternative even after the war, because having that alternative reduces their vulnerability to future disruptions. For all of those reasons, I believe Turkey's position as the controller of the middle corridor is not a temporary windfall. It is a structural advantage that will persist for years, generating revenue and geopolitical leverage long after this war ends. Let me close with a broader observation about what this tells us about the nature of power in the 21st century. The 20th century model of power was military dominance. The country with the most aircraft carriers, the most nuclear weapons, the most troops, was the country that shaped outcomes. The 21st century model, or at least one version of it, is infrastructural control. The country that controls the roads, the rails, the ports, the pipelines, the data cables, the logistics networks, is the country that can extract rent from every transaction that flows through those networks. Turkey does not have the military power to challenge the United States or China. Turkey's defense budget is a fraction of either. But Turkey controls the infrastructure that connects two of the world's largest economies, and that control generates billions of dollars in revenue and gives Turkey a seat at every negotiating table that matters. This is the lesson that smaller powers are learning from Turkey's success. You do not need to win wars. You need to position yourself so that when wars disrupt the primary routes, the alternatives run through your territory. You do not need to be the strongest. You need to be indispensable. Turkey became indispensable by building infrastructure, maintaining relationships, and waiting for the moment when the world would need what Turkey had built. That moment arrived on February 28, 2026, when the United States bombed Iran and closed the Strait of Hormuz. And in the 2 months since, Turkey has made $45 billion without firing a single shot. One country made $45 billion from this war without fighting a single battle. That country is Turkey. And the strategic model Turkey has demonstrated, infrastructure as leverage, multi-directional diplomacy as insurance, patience as strategy, is a model that other countries will study and attempt to replicate for years to come. Watch what happens next, because Turkey's success in this war is not just about Turkey. It is about what power looks like when the old rules stop working and new players find new ways to win.